What's the first thing that pops in your head when you hear the name NightForce? And then what's the first thing that pops in your head when you hear the name ATACR? So when you hear the NightForce ATACR brought up in almost any context, there's a good chance that you're going to immediately think of durability, American made, and really stunning looking. I really like how all the attackers are laid out. I like all the controls. I like the way that they're designed. I like that they're all American made. And I like that if you were to have one of these in your hand, if your rifle were to fail, you could basically bludgeon someone with it and not have to worry about it. Like most other attackers that we've looked at on this channel, albeit just two of them, this has a locking eyepiece, which I'm a huge fan of. It also has the signature magnification ring that moves with the entire rear ocular housing, and that is just to prevent a means of egress to enter into the scope body. So it's a little bit stronger, and it's definitely a little bit less likely to have anything come in. One way that you have to combat this if you want to run caps are run the Tenebrex caps that come included with the kit for this thing. The little piece slips over the back eyepiece. You then snug down the screw, and then you're good to go. And as you increase the magnification, if you don't like where the flip cap is, you just turn it over to the side. Before I get too lost, the magnification ring feels fantastic. Silky smooth, but very well damped. It requires a good bit of effort to turn. And once you turn it, you know it's not going to go anywhere. Underneath the battery compartment, you will see that there is a standard CR2032 battery in there, and it's held in this very beautiful way. It's kind of like a wedding band or an engagement ring, where the stone is just sort of held in there with a bunch of fingers to be out on display for everybody. It's a very nice looking setup in there, but it makes me wonder about its overall strength and longevity, especially if you were to take this cap off and accidentally drop it. However, the push button for the illumination is good. It's not my favorite style of illumination control, but for a lot of people, they prefer buttons over rheostats. At least in this system, it works fairly well, and odds are if you do need it, you're going to be in a darker environment anyway, which means that you'll actually be able to see what the illumination looks like, which is very important. Because the battery compartment cap and the side parallax are in the exact same housing, you do have to keep in mind that when you do tighten up that cap, so this way, as you're adjusting the parallax, it doesn't eventually loosen up on you. It's just something to take note of. Because if you turn it a little bit too far or a little bit too fast, you could see it very easily unscrews. But this is not the only scope to have that issue. Cinch it down pretty tight and you should be okay as long as you don't bang it off of the maximum side parallax. I should also mention that the side parallax on this goes down to 11 yards, so extremely close, which is awesome for all of you precision close range shooters. And the damping on it is wonderful as well. The turrets on this are non-locking, or at least the elevation is non-locking. Well, the windage is non-locking as well, but it is at least capped, which I'm a fan of, especially on a scope that has a reticle that you could use for holding and milling. But loosening up the cap and you will see that you have a beautiful windage turret that sounds and feels splendid. One thing I have to say about all of the NightForces that I've gotten my hands on recently, all of the turrets feel really good, and this is no exception. If, however, you are looking for a locking elevation turret, the only attacker to have a locking elevation turret is the 4-16x42 in the first focal plane. So, if you are curious to whether or not this has a locking turret on the elevation, it does not. However, it does have a good zero-stop mechanism, so you shouldn't really have to worry about it too much. The front is already pre-set up for Tenebrex caps, which again come inside the box, and I must say I really do like Tenebrex caps. They are definitely my second favorite, only second to the Vortex Defenders so far. I still prefer those with the rubber cover that they have and the ability to fold completely flat, but these are very well made. They are made in Canada, and you can get them in a couple of different colors if you don't like it. And if you don't like how it looks in the front, if you never plan on running a cap, you could always unthread that and have a very nice looking 50mm front objective to show off to the world. Now, I did not take this out of the spur mount because the individual that sent it in to me had it exactly where he wanted it, and I was able to make do with how it came, and I had no issues with it. Nevertheless, though, the weight comes in at just over 43.5 ounces with the spur, but NightForce claims it's about 35.2 ounces naked. So definitely a little bit on the higher side as far as weight goes, but I don't think if you're looking to buy this, you're overly concerned about the weight. No, no, no. If you buy an ATACR, you buy it for its durability, its build quality, and its overall fit, feel, and finish. And of course, the glass clarity, because how could you not? The 4-16 is excellent, but is this 4-20 any good? Well, the first thing that you're going to notice is that this has a massive amount of tunneling. Tunneling is when you very clearly see it at 4x, the view through it's very small. And as we increase the magnification to roughly 6 or 7x, it fills out the ocular view looking through it, making it appear like you're zoomed in more. All it's doing is making the image larger, so technically it is zooming in. But it's definitely not my favorite. One company that does this is US Optics. They do that a lot, and the main benefit is to get a better field of view downrange. And it could be said that it does have a very large field of view, 6.1 feet at 100 yards at 20x, but as you'll see in the side-by-sides, it's not that much larger than a lot of the competition. This comes in 5 different reticle flavors. You get the Tremor 3, you have this Mil-C, an MOA version of this, and then an MOA and Mil version of the XT reticle if you want something with a drop. I think the XT reticle would definitely be my choice, but going down to 4x, I think it's just going to be okay. The illumination here doesn't seem that impressive, but just wait until we take this thing out in actual real-world environments. You'll see a much larger difference. The turrets sound and feel very good. They have a nice, solid, positive click with all of the detents, but I can't help but wonder if they would have been even better sounding and feeling if NightForce has opted for 10 mils per rotation as opposed to 12. I'm sure there's a reason for doing it, and probably part of it was because how many times you really have to dial above 12 mils anyway in normal practical shooting?
NightForce ATACR forward to 20 by 50. No shift on the target with the reticle at any magnification. Side parallax doesn't look like it shifts all that much, and we can get a very sharp and clear image down here. Reticle lines up to the target perfectly fine. Let's do a mini box test. Perfect performance, 4 and 4. Let's bring back the windage to 0. Resets perfectly. Let's continue up. Perfect elevation gain. Image does look a little soft. I'm adjusting the side parallax. Looks like we can tweak it just a little bit. So not the end of the world so far. Returns back to 0. Pretty good. Adjust the side parallax again. There we go. Check for windage on the slop on the windage.
It's a perfect performance. There's no slop to the windage or elevation turrets. This was a used scope. I don't know how long the individual that has owned it, but judging from the other gear that he sent, he uses all of his stuff religiously. So to know that this thing still tracks absolutely perfect really does warm the cockles of my heart. Moving out to my backyard, focusing on 81-yard sheet of paper, which is basically my part of my tracking test setup. Just laminated, attached to a tree, because why not? Make do with what you got, right? The view through this thing at 4x is rather small. Compared to some others, it's on par with some of the worser performing optics. However, the reticle, at least this mil-C, is still fairly visible, definitely on the usable side of things, as opposed to some other reticles that are a little bit too fine to the point you can't see them. And illumination out here does do a pretty good job, but it wasn't a very bright sunny day. It was quite overcast when I did this. Taking up to about 6x or so, you could see that we do get most of the tunneling out of the way, but then we have shadows that creep up for a few x further. I tried adjusting the scope inside the mount to get it much better than this, and it was basically exactly where it was from the beginning. So what you're seeing is basically what you're going to get. However, I must maintain that the naked eye will be able to adapt between those shadows and the view looking through it a little bit easier than my very rigid camera setup. Once we are zoomed into maximum magnification at 81 yards, we could dial that side parallax to get a razor sharp looking image. It is gorgeous. No chromatic aberration to speak of, albeit it was kind of overcast and we don't have a lot of high contrast targets. It's only one piece of paper on a dark tree. But look at everything around this. Edge to edge sharpness, even on the bushes well behind the tree, are sharp as can be. And everything in the foreground is beautiful as well. I mean, very minimal distance change, all things considered. But this thing really does look fantastic when you get it just right. And that's what I was kind of hoping for this thing. The 4-16 by 42 is a perfect example of what I consider to be a perfect optic in every single way, shape, and form. And I was hoping that this would at least get close to that. At its top end, I think it easily matches what the 4-16 is capable of doing. But you know what? Maybe we'll find that out soon enough. And to show off that sweet 11-yard minimum parallax setting, this tree is about 15 yards away from the window, and as you could see, we could dial in a very wonderful looking image, albeit slightly washed out from how my camera settings were. But nevertheless, it is a very good looking image, and we still have plenty of room to go to get a better zero on a closer target. So, very, very good as far as the side parallax range is concerned, in my opinion. As I'm sure at least one of you out there is going to wonder about its low light performance, because you might plan on throwing this on a very high-end hunting rig, albeit one you might not lug through the woods for 18 hours at a time because of its 35 ounces of chubbiness. But for anyone wondering what its low light performance is, it's good. I'm not going to say it's great because there are a couple of things about it that I'm like, but really, I'm just nitpicking. I'm playing with you guys. The illumination in lower light is fantastic. We already saw it earlier on a slightly overcast day, and it was good, maybe even better than good. And out here, it's better than good. It's flat out great. This is the maximum illumination setting. We are at 4x. It is well into the early evening, and we're going to see how good this image is going to look once we start increasing the magnification. I love how NightForce opted to illuminate the entirety of the drop reticle down to probably 60 mils, I want to say I counted up to. It's just nutty. It's fantastic. And so is the brightness level at 20x. From 4 to 20, I noticed no degradation or loss of brightness coming through the scope, whether it was to the camera or to my eye. One of the reasons why I was able to see if it was to my eye or not is because the exit pupil on this thing is actually set up in a way that I've never really experienced before. I think part of it has to do with the significant amount of tunneling at 4x, but the exit pupil at 4x is 8.3 millimeter. To compare that to the ZCO 420, that's 10.9 millimeter at 4x. However, at 20x, where the ZCO is 2 millimeter, the ATACR 2.5 millimeter. It is 25% larger. So the higher up the magnification you go, the more forgiving the Eyebox gets relative to the magnification that you're at, which is backwards. It's absolutely backwards. And I think that's a big reason why this scope has so much tunneling, is so that it can be super efficient and effective at the higher magnification ranges. And that makes all the difference in the world when we look at the scope from a different standpoint. So that's kind of interesting and very, very noteworthy is just how large the exit pupil is. I will be making some comparisons very soon, but I'll throw out some numbers out there from just running down the list that I have on the sheet about how the exit pupil compares to other optics in similar magnifications or even smaller magnifications, and just how good this is. But it's definitely something that you probably wouldn't expect. Moving on to extended long range, around 500 yards here at 20x, and boy, oh boy, can you ask for a better looking image. Zero chromatic aberration, zero issues as far as sharpness goes or consistency across the image. You could practically count all of the cells on that solar panel. Look at the girders. Look at those trusses. Everything there. You can count the rivets at 500 yards with this thing. It's sensational. Backing it down to roughly 10x, we're going to slowly push this out to about 1,000 yards and then beyond. It's impressive. It's really impressive. It's like a high horsepower, low torque car, like a turbo Honda Civic. I'm not talking about like a new Type R. I'm talking like a K20Z3 turbo. It's going to have amazing power up top, but down low, below 4,000 RPM, it's going to be a dog. But from 4,500 to 9,000, it is going to rip. That is how the scope performs. At the lower magnifications, with the tunneling alone, it's very challenging to look through it and see things relative to how the rest of the scope looks at higher magnification as far as the view looking through it. It's a substantial difference. Not to say, again, that the view through it at 4x is so small that it's unusable, but it's jarring, especially if you're trying to use this thing as a full range of especially if you're trying to use the full magnification that the scope has to offer. I'm trying not to get tongue twisted on this one. But the higher up you go, the better it gets. The clearer the image looks, and the more refined it feels. It's very bizarre. It's almost unlike any other scope I've really experienced, and that's what makes this scope so good. However, it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, because you might want to use this thing in a role that involves a 4x and a 20x. And if you get this with that sort of mindset and concept, I think you might be a little disappointed, because below 6x, it's a little bit more challenging than I would like. Again, though, the reticle, at least this, the MIL-C or the MOAC, whichever one you get, does look like it's scaled very well. I'm not the biggest fan of the hash marks on it, but despite the reticle choice here, the image still here at 1,000 yards is stunning. Absolutely breathtaking. It's only a 20x. Some people would say, oh, it's not enough magnification. I would much rather have more resolution than more magnification. 20x, I feel, is a very practical maximum magnification. I think a 4x is also very good on the minimum as well. Anyway, I increase it 10 mils, and you can see that we do have a slight shift to the exit pupil. Again, I don't know if that was as noticeable as it was because of the way this thing is designed optically, but a very minor adjustment on the height of the camera to look through it yields basically very similar results to when we had no elevation dialed in. It's stunning. There's no loss of sharpness, no loss of brightness, no changes to the focus or the parallax, nothing. Nothing. It is so consistent and so beautiful. Yeah, that's why you buy an ATACR. But whether you go with the MIL-C or the MIL-XT or the Tremor 3, I think all of those reticles are going to be pretty well suited in this magnification range. Definitely better than the NX8 2.5 to 20, where the XT is basically invisible until about 4 or 5x. Here, you're at least going to be at that minimum, and it should be pretty easy to spot. Readjusting our scope to be at 0 mils of elevation, setting the camera just right, and now focusing at 2,000 or so yards of power towers. The furthest, or the closest one all the way to the left, is around the 500 to 600 yard mark, and that farthest one's roughly 2,000 yards. The depth of field on this thing is sensational. What that means is if you are engaging targets at varying distances, you do not have to futz around and play around with side parallax to make sure all of your targets are in focus. This is great if you're trying to do fast transition between targets and just get the shots off as fast as possible. I do know that some precision shooters prefer having a very shallow depth of field so they can just super hyper focus on just the target, but on a practical use or a more generalized use optic, I really like having a very large depth of field. At 20x, shifting the camera side to side, even though I already finished, yielded impressive results. The Eyebox in this thing is very forgiving at 20x, and the image stability is perfect. Both the image that we see downrange and the reticle maintain a perfect level of sharpness until you literally can't look out the scope anymore. Slowly bringing it down in increments of 4, I want to say I did, you'll see that the result stays very consistent. But as we get closer and closer to the minimum, it's not going to get significantly more forgiving. Like I mentioned earlier, this scope's a little bit backwards with just how it's set up. And coming down to 4x, shifting the camera side to side, it's larger than what it was at 20x, but not to the point where it's like, oh my God, wow, this is a completely different experience. To let that live for you a little bit more dynamically, let's get behind this thing at 4x with the illumination on full in my backyard. Parallax was set properly, and you can see the 4x isn't terrible, but it's nowhere near up to snuff as far as a lot of the competition that this thing is going to be going up against. But again, it's still usable and serviceable, but it's nowhere near as good as some of the best scopes could be. Even just some minor better scopes aren't going to be that good. Increasing the magnification to 10x, and this is basically where we have a full view looking through the scope, and as much of the shadows have disappeared as possible. At this magnification, you can see moving around it isn't that challenging. There are some scopes at 10x that are really good, some that are really bad. This is middle of the road. I wouldn't say it's exceptional, but it's definitely usable. And again, this is basically the minimum magnification I'd recommend to really start taking advantage of what the scope has to offer. At 15x now, you can see we can still move around it a fair amount and still find our way to the center very easily. The illumination is also extremely good at helping guide you to the center, because as you can see, as we get to the point where we can't see through the scope anymore, the illumination does seem to be more visible than most others in this segment. At 20x, you will see it's nowhere near as challenging as it should be or has been on other optics of this very similar magnification range. And this is in slightly lower light environments. If it was brighter out, it'd be a little bit easier, at least easier to pick up on a lighter target downrange. But I like the tree because it really does add a high level of complexity to it. And I like doing this outside too sometimes. This way we can test the anti-reflectiveness of all of the coatings. Let's get into some side-by-sides, because this is the most exciting part for you and for me. On the left will be the 4-20, and we're going to start out with this thing's probably biggest competitor, in my opinion, the ATACR 4-16x42 on the right-hand side. Both of these have kind of sort of similar reticles. I think I do prefer the mil-R for a generalized optic, because I think it's a little bit easier to pick up and a little bit easier to use, at least for me. I like the way the hash marks are divvied out as opposed to with the the mil-C. The mil-C just looks a little bit confusing and complicated. Despite the fact that there is a 4x difference on both of these optics at their maximums, it doesn't seem like it's a huge difference here at 100 yards. But as we extend a little bit further, you'll see how that plays into their strengths and weaknesses. As far as the 4-16, what you could expect to pay for one of those is about $2,500. The price on this 4-20, around $3,000, so a little bit less expensive than the 4-20. The 4-16x42 does have that amazing lock on top, which Lowlight, I think, sued NightForce over, and that's why they don't use it anymore, which is very upsetting and disappointing, but such is life. As far as length, the 4-20 is just shy of 14 inches, whereas the 4-16 is 12.6, so about an inch and a half shorter, which is pretty considerable. And the 4-16 is 5 ounces lighter at 30 ounces, which really isn't that bad, all things considered. The biggest takeaway here is going to be the field of view. Here's an interesting note. The 4-20 ATACR has 23.6 feet at 100 yards at 4x, whereas the 4-16 ATACR, 26.9 feet. So well over 10% difference. In fact, 15% difference. That's huge. But on the top end, The 4 to 16, 6.9 feet. The 4 to 20, 6.1 feet. So despite the fact that it's got 4x extra magnification, the field of view is so good downrange that they're almost comparable to one another. Quite impressive. As far as the exit pupil, this is another thing that I wanted to really drive home. The 4 to 16 at 4x is 10.3. The 4 to 20 is 8.3, so a huge difference there. But now on the top end, the 16x on the 4 to 16 is at 2.7 millimeter to the 2.5 millimeter on the 4 to 20. Again, 4x more on the magnification and 2% less on the overall exit pupil size. That means that using the ATACR 4 to 20 at 20x is awesome. It's as good as using the ATACR 4 to 16 by 42 at 16x, but you have 4x extra magnification. So what comes down to the real meat and potatoes? In fact, wait, there's one other thing I have to talk about. The overall elevation on the 4 to 16 is 26 mils, and the 4 to 20, a stupid impressive 38 mils of total elevation. So insane, frankly insane. The 4 to 20 is much more capable of dialing up for elevation at distance, whereas the 4 to 16 really isn't. As far as which one of these scopes is going to be right for you, if you're in the market for an ATACR, it depends on if you want to really focus and drive home that SBR style build. I would absolutely recommend the 4 to 16. It's a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, offers exceptional glass, very good reticle options, the locking turret. A lot of what the 4 to 20 offers, but it's more of a consistent and stable performance where you could expect how it's going to perform at 4x and 10x and 16x. Whereas with the 4 to 20, it does seem like it works a little bit backwards. But I would absolutely recommend the 4 to 20 for someone that's looking to go with a little bit more extended range, but doesn't want to give up glass clarity or any of the overall mechanical performances of the scope. That's where the 4 to 20 really shines, is the in-between to higher magnification range, and it's proof positive between these two. So what if you really want a NightForce, but you can't afford an ATACR, or you're thinking it's going to be a stretch? Well, there is a simple solution, dear viewer. Check out its cousin, the NX8. This 2.5 to 20 by 50 has the same top-end magnification and same front objective, but has a 30mm tube as opposed to 34mm tube. Despite that, though, its numbers and performance-wise dictate that it's actually a little bit more impressive than some of you might think. If you've ever been behind an NX8 2.5 to 20 by 50, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. The numbers on this scope don't seem to do it justice, especially when you factor in it's $1,000 less expensive than the ATACR. However, the NX8s are made in Japan, so if you are wanting to buy an American-made optic, this is not going to be for you. However, if you're looking to save $1,000 and get a scope that might perform as good as the 4 to 20 without costing as much, the NX8 is definitely a solid option. The overall length on the NX8 is almost 2 inches shorter than the ATACR at 12 inches. It's very short. It's also very light at 28 ounces. As far as the field of view, of course, the minima on the NX8 is going to be way better, 41.8 feet. But get this, the field of view at the maximum magnification is actually substantially larger with the NX8 as opposed to the ATACR, 7 feet versus 6.1. That's pretty substantial. But you want to know what else is also kind of substantial and kind of weird? NightForce claims that the NX8 at 2.5x only has a 7.1 millimeter exit pupil. That's why getting behind this scope is kind of challenging in the middle magnifications. However, at 20x, both the ATACR and NX8 share the exact same exit pupil size, 2.5 millimeter. That's nuts. Absolutely nuts. Eye relief is, guess what? Also very, very close to one another. 3.5 feet for the ATACR, 3.44 for the NX8. I also neglected to mention that the eye relief for the 4 to 16 ATACR is also 3.5 inches. But another area where I'm actually kind of blown away by figuring these numbers out, the NX8 is capable of 32 mils of elevation, where, again, the ATACR is a much larger 38, but still, the NX8's right on this thing's heels. And sure, if we were to look at these images side by side on the exact same day, we'd be able to pick out a lot of differences, I'm sure. But right here, when I was able to film with both of these optics, granted the NX8's a while ago at this point, the NX8 was just so impressive. And here's the thing. The NX8 didn't have a locking elevation turret, which was like my only real gripe, because a lot of people want this for SBRs, and I too would love this for an SBR, an SPR, not an SBR. But in the future, like, I think the NX8, it ticks a lot of boxes. But a non-locking elevation turret's a bit of a bummer, and it's a bit of a buzzkill for a lot. For myself, it's like I don't even want to consider it. Yes, it might have a zero stop, but I like knowing that my turrets, when they're locked, they're locked. They're not going to move. I know some people that will never go with an unlocked turret again because they themselves had their turret be adjusted, whether moving it in and out of a bag or by accident or brushing up against something, and then they missed a shot on the buck. That was actually fairly recent for one of my friends, and he said, I'll never do that again. And there you go. There are cases where having stuff that when you lock it or leave it where it is and you never have to worry about it being deviated off of what your zero is, it's a wonderful thing. Another thing that's wonderful are just the views to both of these scopes. I mean, the ATACR is very good, but the NX8 is just breathtakingly good, especially given the price. Its overall performance is exceptional. The MIL-XT reticle can be had on both of these optics, and I think at 20x it's superb, but in the lower magnifications, it's a little bit finer to see. The MIL-C is definitely a little bit easier, a little bit thicker to pick up at the lower magnification ranges, but you can't go wrong with either of these options. It just totally depends on budget. Funny I mentioned budget, and then I compare the ATACR against an even more expensive optic, the ZCO 420. What can I say about the ZCO 420? It's got a 36mm tube. It's $4,000, so $1,000 more expensive than the ATACR. It's a little bit over an inch shorter. It's about the same weight. The overall field of views are about the same. Actually, much larger with the ZCO at minimum magnification. But again, that's because the ATACR has a severe amount of tunneling. But at the maximum magnification, they're about the same. And their exit pupils are pretty close as well. But at 20x, you have a 2mm exit pupil for the ZCO versus the 2.5 for the ATACR. Down low at 4x, you have 8.3 with the ATACR and 10.9 with the ZCO, which is quite large and in charge. As far as eye relief, they're both the same at 3.5 inches. And as far as overall elevation gain, you would think the ZCO having a 36mm tube would help with that a little bit, but it doesn't. It falls 3 mils shy of the ATACR at 35 mils. Still very impressive and probably more than enough for 99.9% of the shooters out there. But if you're looking to squeeze the most out of your turrets and maybe not run a canted mount, the ATACR is absolutely the clear winner out of all of these so far. As much as I like the ATACRs, and I love the 4-16, and I like the 4-20, I wish it would have performed a little bit similar to the ZCO 4-20. At their top end, at their maximums, they both perform insanely well. The ZCO 420, I quoted it as, or at least I'm quoting myself as how I phrased it in that review. It was an experience. It was hard to sort of justify into words alone. It's kind of like going to see a live show on Broadway. Even if you're not a fan of shows in general or being in Manhattan, when you see a good show and you have dozens and dozens of cast members on a very complicated stage and dress work and singing and dancing, when they nail something, it takes your breath away. The ZCO 420 is that scope for me. I think it's one of the best scopes I've ever reviewed. Certainly one of the more expensive scopes, but experience-wise, it was really sensational. But the ATACR is not too far behind, and it costs $1,000 less. But the ZCO does have locking turrets on the windage and elevation. It's got a couple of more features other than the ATACR. But is it worth an extra $1,000? Well, if you can say, oh, well, $1,000 is nothing for me, then go with the ZCO. But if $3,000 is more than enough for you, as long as you're willing to accept how the ATACR performs and how it handles its business, I think you'd be very satisfied with that scope as well. And lastly, going from one extreme to the next, we are going to take a look at the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 4 to 20 by 50. Athlon, I think, got the Helos BTR Gen 2 series of optics pretty down pat. The 2 to 12 is nothing short of fantastic for the price point, and the same can be said for this 4 to 20 in my opinion. I think it's a very good alternative for something kind of like the ATACR, but at a much lower price point. No, I'm not saying that the Helos rivals the ATACR in any way, shape, or form, but it doesn't cost anywhere near as much. In fact, it comes in around the $560 price point, and that's before you could find these things on sale. So I reckon it's a sixth the price of the ATACR. Does it perform a sixth as well? No, it performs quite good. But the ATACR is going to beat it in almost every way. But the Athlon also has a couple of tricks up its sleeve, like locking windage at elevation turrets, and turrets that really sound and feel way above their price point. In fact, all the controls on the Heloses are really solid, again, for that mid $500 price point. As far as the overall specs between this and the ATACR, it's only about a half inch shorter than the ATACR at 13.3 inches. Weight-wise, it's 8 ounces lighter, so significantly lighter. Field of view, let's take a look at that one. At 4x, we have 27.9 feet for the Helos, 23.6 for the ATACR. But sadly, due to the overall size of the view looking through the Helos, it falls short at 5.6 feet versus 6.1 at 20x. Is that a horrible performance? No. But Athlon was, I feel, wise enough to not try to make the view through the Helos and tune the glass to have too large of a view or too large of an exit pupil and make the image sort of fall apart. By keeping the view through the scope smaller, typically, you increase the resolution. It's like having a low-resolution image that you download and you want to print it out on a big sheet of paper. And when you print it, it looks very pixelated. But when you had it on your phone screen or your laptop screen, it looks really good. Same concept applies here. Typically, when you have a slightly smaller view looking through it and everything's just scaled slightly down, it can look way better than when it's scaled up. The ATACR does the exact opposite of this, but the Helos, being a $500 and something scope versus a $3,000 scope, there's a reason for that giant price point difference. I couldn't find any good data as far as what the exit pupil on the Helos is, but by my quick calculations and measurements, I got around 2mm at 20x, and for 4x, I was getting too large of a number. The focus on it seemed very broad, so it's pretty big. Getting behind the Helos is not challenging at all, but it has a more typical sort of Eyebox and exit pupil than what the ATACR has to offer. It progressively gets smaller as you go up in magnification, whereas the ATACR is basically the opposite, all things considered. Am I seriously saying you should buy a Helos over an ATACR? No. But if you like the 4 to 20 magnification range, you could do far worse than what the Helos has to offer, especially for the price point. What if, again, you already have an ATACR 4 to 20 on your precision rig and you wanted to get something that was way less expensive to throw on a trainer? Something like the Helos would possibly work. The view through them are fairly similarly sized. I feel that the Helos is a perfect in-between the minimum and the maximum for the ATACR. And they're really inexpensive, and the reticles are pretty nice, and the turrets are really nice, and the controls are actually all really nice. The illumination's pretty nice. They're very nice scopes for the price. They might be made in China, but for 550-ish bucks, what could you really expect nowadays, unfortunately? Or at least in scopes that offer as much as what the Helos series does. Instead of going on and on and on and on and on about this scope, I'm going to sum it up really quickly. It's an ATACR. ATACRs are really great in my experience. I haven't really been let down by a NightForce product. The first one I reviewed was the SHV 4 to 14. The view through that was small. The scope body was very large, actually very similar to what the ATACR looks like here at 4X. But optically, that thing was very capable and sharp. Ultimately, I picked the PST Gen 2 to 3 to 15 over it, only because the view through the PST was significantly larger and it made for a much better shooting experience for me. As long as you understand what the scope's shortcomings are with the tunneling from 4 to like 6 to 8x, and you're okay with that, I think you're going to love the scope. Really, I think it's in its sweet spot between 10 to 20x. And if you plan on using this thing at those higher magnifications anyway, if you're looking for a very robust, very optically beautiful scope with a lot of elevation adjustment and some pretty good reticle options, in my opinion, the ATACR should be on your short list if you're looking to spend $3,000. However, if you're looking to save a little bit of money, the NX8 2.5 to 20 is another great option. If you're looking for a build setup that's going to be a little bit lighter but almost as capable, the 4 to 16 ATACR. I can go on and on as far as listing goes. Overall, the scope performed well. I wasn't really ready for the tunneling effect, but once I got to use the scope a little more and I understood how well it was set up and for what this thing was trying to achieve, rather, I frankly quite liked it. But it's not something that I would personally buy, again, because I really don't like tunneling. Even though it does have some benefits, I'd rather have something that's a little bit more consistent throughout the entire magnification range. And you might too. And there's no shame in that. But if you're looking for something that's in this optical magnification range and in this capacity, the ATACR is almost as good as it gets. With all that being said, a huge thank you to the individual that sent this in for review. I love getting my hands on stuff, whether it's $30 or $3,000. It's great to be able to add all of this stuff into my library and my repertoire and just get a better sense for how some of these companies do their business and handle things. I'm very impressed so far with the lineup from NightForce, but as you saw from my LPVO review not too long ago, the ATACR was very good, but it wasn't my favorite. Whereas the NX8, I think I actually preferred a lot of the controls on the NX8 over the ATACR, but the view through the NX8 was like the exact opposite of what the 2.5 to 20 is. I think their LPVOs can definitely use some tweaking, but their medium-powered and high-powered variable optics so far have been their sweet spot, their bread and butter. So, again, a huge thank you to the individual that sent this in. Thank you for making this video possible, because I love doing this stuff. And thank you all so much for watching. It's because of all of you that I still bother doing this, because hopefully you appreciate my content enough to keep watching, and hopefully it'll help you make a more informed purchase decision when it's time for you to spend money on a scope. So, thank you all very much for watching. And as always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.